There's always been an obsession with video game graphics ever since their inception, and as years have passed, graphical technology has improved as hardware has improved, naturally. And seeing the leaps in graphics since the early 2000s has been nothing but amazing to witness during my time as a gamer. But over the last decade, graphical improvements began to mean much less. Comparing games from 2023 to 2013, I often find that not just a few, but a lot of those games from before 2013 still look better than the ones releasing in current year. Now certainly there are some noticeable improvements if you really focus on the textures and analyze the pixels when comparing a modern game to one a decade old, but playing a game like Dishonored from 2012 or Bioshock Infinite from 2013, or even The Order 1886 from 2014, if you didn't know any better, you'd think these games were new releases. They just don't look as dated as you might think for being 10 years old. Yet despite the technology getting better since then, very few games can top these games, or even match them visually. So why is this? Well, like all things, a tool is only as good as the one who wields it. And when in the right hands, modern game development tools can produce amazingly impressive results. But unfortunately, so many studios have been putting out games that, while graphically are impressive due to their technology that they're built with, end up looking like utter dog shit. A game like Forspoken has great graphics, but looks extremely generic and almost blinding in its visuals, in a very washed out and ugly sort of way. Immortals of Aveum, a game released just a few days ago running on Unreal Engine 5, is graphically outstanding, but looks like an Unreal Engine asset flip project, even though I know it isn't. The devs probably did work very hard on creating those assets, but it just doesn't come across that way. And it doesn't help that this game in particular is so visually bloated. Like, I love fast-paced games, but I can't tell what the fuck is happening on screen here. The visibility is just awful due to the graphical and artistic style they went for. While I understand that realistic graphics sell to the casual audience, I'm always looking towards companies that have a more distinctive art style instead, even if it is more low poly. Some wrongfully ascribe this generic look of video games to the Unreal Engine itself, but just because a game is made in Unreal doesn't mean they have to look like this. I think Sea of Thieves is a great example of a game that takes advantage of the strengths that the Unreal Engine provides, and is a beautiful game in many regards. But it still has a distinctive art style that separates it from a game like, say, Atomic Heart. It's not the engine, it's how it's being used. Firewatch, a game made in the Unity engine, is another example of a game that's a visual treat, yet is not what I would consider AAA graphics. And to get to the main point here, I'm a strong believer that graphics don't really matter. To some degree, sure, but we've reached a point in the last 10 years, and especially in current year, where graphics have mostly plateaued. So art style is everything. And the fact that games from 10 to 15 years ago still hold up really well today is a testament to how true that statement is. Games like Rage from 2011 or Stalker from 2006 still hold up incredibly well, and games like Fable or Dragon Age and Kingdoms of Amalur employ a timeless art style and visual style so they can be enjoyed for years to come. 2 years ago with the release of Elden Ring, there was some very strange rage bait online about Elden Ring having bad graphics.
The graphics are dog shit.
Are you sure about that?
The graphics are dog shit. The graphics are dog shit. The graphics are dog shit.
But I'd take 100 different games with an art style half as good as what FromSoft delivered before another Atomic Heart, or Immortals of Aveum, or Forspoken. And I do want to reiterate something I've mentioned in my past videos, and that's that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. You don't have to pick just one. A game can have both amazing graphics and an amazing art style, and even high visibility. I think games like Bioshock and Dishonored perfectly encapsulate that. But even games like Doom 2016 and Eternal are great looking games, and a trick I recently learned about Doom Eternal is that the lighting on the enemies are separate from the environment, so they are always lit and clearly visible, even in darker areas. This in turn makes the game look less cinematic or realistic, but is much better for the gameplay Doom serves, and even the art style. The game director Hugo Martin said that during development for Eternal, they had at first made the lighting come from the environment much like they did with Doom 2016, but in playtesting it felt really bad because oftentimes you couldn't clearly see what it was that got you killed. And with Eternal being a much more punishing game and more fast-paced than 2016, visibility took precedent over realism. And I think what's really important to take away from that is visibility really matters in games. It isn't just Immortals that has this problem, it's a problem I and many others have with many different modern games. Now, I primarily play PC on a 27-inch monitor like 4 feet from my face, Yet oftentimes there are so many cases where it's almost impossible to see an enemy that's right in front of me. Why does it feel like everyone just blends into everything? Now, some might throw out the realism argument here again, and games going for a more military sim style or something like that should lean into the fact that it's hard to see enemies. And while I can understand that to a certain degree, seeing things in real life is much different than on a screen. Looking at a mountain range in real life versus a picture of that mountain range, your eyes can pick out much more things in person, whereas in a picture you're going to lose a lot of detail because you just have captured a 3D environment but on a 2D plane. And when you play video games, it's on a screen, which is essentially a picture. You aren't going to be able to see the same things on this mountainside in Battlefield 2042 compared to if you saw this mountain in person. I think back to the 2008 to 2012 era of FPS games, and the textures were a bit lower resolution, but the character models were often highly detailed, and it really made them stand out by having sharper objects on somewhat of a more blurry backdrop. This made it almost more akin to real life because your eyes can pick out an enemy a bit easier in those older games, especially at a distance. And funnily enough, you'll often see competitive FPS players cranking their graphics down in games in order to have a bit more of a competitive edge. And while I don't think every game should look like BattleBit, it's been a lot of fun playing that game and having long-ranged engagements in my gameplay. You can actually see enemies from afar, or see someone when they peek out from the side of a building. And it feels great to have some of that long-range gunplay in a Battlefield-style game again, like I did back in Bad Company 2. I think one of the best examples of art style being more important than graphics though is with the PS5 Demon's Souls remake. I think in every way except for graphics, the remake is worse than the original. The atmosphere is much diminished, the art direction became more generic looking, and both the enemy designs and environments have been changed to go against the visual storytelling that the original did so successfully. And in turn, while Elden Ring doesn't have the graphical fidelity of the Demon's Souls remake, I think it's a far better looking game because of its incredibly strong art direction. Another example I've mentioned in the past is about the Destiny franchise, where there are many instances where Destiny 1 looks better than Destiny 2. The art direction and lighting of the sequel leaves the game feeling a bit more plastic than its predecessor. And while there is definitely some incredible visuals inside of Destiny 2 areas, it's when comparing places inside both games that you can really start to notice just how big of a drop-off there is in the sequel. Several shots on the Cosmodrome or the moon are noticeably uglier, and even in the reprised raids like King's Fall, great use of shadows and contrasting colors from the original are now washed out and missing detail in the sequel. Some of my favorite games visually are ones that use an almost cartoon aesthetic, like Overwatch, which has a very Pixar-esque look, or games like Kingdoms of Amalur, or the Fable games, or a game like Alice Madness Returns. These games all hold up incredibly well today. Their visual designs have stood the test of time and can be played today without feeling too dated, due to the strength of the art direction and atmospheric design. Now some games have bad art style and bad graphics, and I think Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are a pretty good example of that. Both graphically and artistically, they look like absolute shit. And that's not the Switch's fault. Sword and Shield on the Switch looks much better than Scarlet and Violet, and for some reason, the more 3D and open world the games have gotten, the worse the visuals and art direction. It's both unfortunate and confusing because a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, a game also on the Switch, looks pretty good given the hardware, and I was hoping Pokemon's visuals would at least be somewhere in that ballpark by now, especially since it's clearly possible. Every time I hear a studio try to sell their game and their focus is on how cinematic or photorealistic it is, I usually just check out. The industry spends so much time trying to make games realistic without remembering that games should focus more on the gameplay and its art direction. It's like they say, every time a game developer brags about how cinematic their game is, an angel loses its wings. I care much less about a world that looks ultra-realistic and more about a world that feels realistic, with a clear, cohesive art direction and world building through its environmental storytelling. And I think sometimes people confuse themselves into thinking a game that looks realistic is more immersive, but I think that has very little to do with making a game immersive. It's more about believability. Do the visuals, sound design, music, and tone of the game mesh well? If so, then that's all that's needed to immerse someone. Going back to Atomic Heart for a second, I think a big reason why it failed to immerse me is despite its impressive visuals graphically, the game's tone and art direction feels very generic, and it pales in comparison to Bioshock at every turn. And I make the comparison to Bioshock because obviously it was a very clear inspiration, and is often compared to Bioshock, But in Atomic Heart, the Unreal Engine technology is all that's selling that game, because the story, the gameplay, and the atmosphere feels pretty uninspired, which is unfortunate. It's a game that otherwise could have been really interesting, if helmed and directed by the right talent. Sometimes I look at games from 2014 and 2015 and think that visuals peaked back then. There's of course exceptions to that in recent years, but I think it's a bit wild that Assassin's Creed Unity from 2014 somehow still has more striking visuals and lighting than the newer games. The Order 1886, despite being a fairly average game, looks absolutely amazing, much better than a lot of Unreal Engine titles in recent years. Dying Light 1 looks more impressive than its sequel. Even Far Cry 4 has more attention to detail than Far Cry 5, with 4 having much more lively environments versus the more static ones of 5. Battlefield 1's destructibility and details beat out 2042, and it's not even close. Infamous Second Son, Arkham Knight, these games still outshine games 8 to 9 years later visually. The graphical technology and more high-res textures are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for modern AAA developers because somehow we keep seeing regressions in so many different areas over the years. It's not just the visuals, but the animations too, but I'll save that for another day. Environmental storytelling is the most effective way to tell a story and immerse us in a world. Humans are visual creatures, and exposition dumping is often a big turnoff. This doesn't mean that dialogue or even some exposition is a bad thing, far from it, but it's important to make sure that the visuals speak for themselves, and the dialogue and exposition service the visuals, rather than the other way around. I think a game like Firewatch does this almost perfectly, and I plan to cover that in a future video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. Thank you guys for watching, leave your thoughts on the discussion of art style versus graphics in the comments section, and I'll see you all in the next one.